Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the story. Now, let's see how Mark's decision unfolds and how he navigates this unexpected and complicated arrangement. Example, please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Mark walked home that night, the rain still pouring down in torrents, his mind racing with everything Eleanor had just said. He had agreed to her proposition, but now, in the cold, quiet streets, it felt surreal. His fingers were numb from the cold, but the weight in his chest was even heavier. How had he gotten here? How could he have agreed to marry a stranger, a woman with a world so far removed from his own? He didn't know her, and yet, he had just given her something more personal than his name, his future. The next morning, the sound of his alarm dragged him from his restless sleep. Mark lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, his mind foggy with exhaustion and confusion. He had agreed to Eleanor's deal, but the reality of it was settling in with full force now. As he lay there, trying to find some sense of clarity, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Eleanor. We'll meet at my lawyer's office at 10 a.m. today. Bring your identification. It's time to make this official. Mark had no idea what he was walking into. He quickly dressed in the same worn-out suit he'd had for years and headed out the door. The drive to Eleanor's office was long, the rain still clinging to the streets, but his thoughts were louder than the sound of the windshield wipers. What was he getting himself into? He had no family left to ask for advice, no one to confide in. The only thing left to do was to follow through. When he arrived at the sleek, glass building, the difference between his life and Eleanor's hit him like a punch to the gut. The building gleamed with wealth and power. He parked his car, a beat-up old model, and walked inside. The lobby was pristine, the marble floors polished to perfection. There were no waiting rooms like the ones he was used to in his small college town. Everything about this place screamed that he didn't belong. A receptionist with a perfectly styled bob looked up as Mark entered. She smiled politely, her eyes scanning him with a subtle judgment. "Mr. Davis, you're expected," she said, motioning for him to take a seat. Mark didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and sat down, trying to ignore the feeling that everyone in this building knew he was out of place. A few minutes later, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her presence immediately commanding the room. She smiled at Mark, her gaze cool and calculated. "I hope you're ready," she said smoothly, her voice as calm as ever. She didn't look nervous at all. She was ready to make this deal official, and he was just a small part of her plan. They walked into the lawyer's office together, where a serious-looking man sat at the desk, already flipping through papers. Eleanor introduced Mark to him as if they were just two business partners coming together for a deal. Mark tried to focus, but the reality of what was happening hit him again. He was about to sign a contract that would change the course of his life forever. The lawyer handed him the papers. "This is standard," he explained, though the words felt meaningless. Mark glanced at the document. His name would be officially tied to Eleanor's, his debts would be cleared, and he would live in a world that felt completely foreign to him. He was agreeing to everything in that moment: the contract, the terms, the life that would follow. He signed, his hand trembling slightly as the pen met the paper. Eleanor looked on with an unreadable expression, but there was a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. She wasn't just getting a husband for appearances, she was getting a solution to her own problems, and he was the answer. "Welcome to the family, Mr. Davis," the lawyer said, looking up with a smile that seemed too rehearsed. The words didn't feel real. Mark stood up, his legs unsteady. He had just signed his future away, and yet, something in his chest had shifted. This was a moment he would never be able to undo. He was legally bound to Eleanor now, a stranger who would become his wife in name only. He had agreed to a business arrangement, but he wondered, was he already regretting it? Or was there more to this deal than he could see? As they left the lawyer's office, Eleanor turned to him, her face showing no emotion. "We'll make the necessary arrangements for the wedding," she said, as if they were discussing something as mundane as a trip to the grocery store. "I'm glad we can move forward." Mark wasn't sure how he was supposed to feel. He should have been relieved, but instead, he felt more lost than ever. The weight of the contract, of the future that lay ahead, was almost too much to bear. And yet, part of him wondered if this was the beginning of something more than he could ever have expected. For the first time, he looked at Eleanor, really looked at her. She was a woman who had everything, yet still seemed like she was missing something. Maybe it was love, maybe it was companionship. He didn't know her well enough to tell. But as the rain continued to fall outside, Mark couldn't help but feel like this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. Now that the contract was signed, everything was changing, and Mark wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The days that followed felt like a blur. Mark moved through them mechanically, each one blending into the next, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. His life had changed overnight, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. She was always calm, always composed, like nothing had shifted at all. Their first public appearance as a couple was a charity gala. Mark had been instructed to wear a tuxedo, something he had never imagined himself in. He barely recognized the man staring back at him in the mirror, so out of place, yet so deeply embedded in this new world he had reluctantly entered. As he arrived at the venue, the grand ballroom dazzled with sparkling chandeliers and elegantly dressed guests. Eleanor, dressed in a silver gown that shimmered with every movement, was already the center of attention. The moment she stepped into the room, people parted for her like she was royalty. She smiled and nodded at familiar faces, her eyes never lingering too long on any one person, always moving forward, always in control. Mark felt small in comparison. He stood by her side, a silent observer, trying his best to blend in, but it was clear that he was an outsider. The guests' eyes often flicked over him, only to return to Eleanor, who effortlessly commanded the room with her presence. He felt like a pawn, a background character in a story that wasn't his own. Eleanor, however, seemed perfectly at ease. She introduced Mark to a few of her colleagues and friends, each one greeting him with polite smiles, some with a hint of curiosity, others with a touch of indifference. He realized, with a pang of discomfort, that his presence here wasn't to be valued in the same way hers was. She was the star, and he was merely an accessory to her success. As the night went on, Eleanor continued to glide through the evening, her smile never faltering, her conversation flowing smoothly. Mark, meanwhile, stood on the sidelines, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? Was this really his life now? He had agreed to this marriage out of necessity, but he hadn't realized just how different their worlds truly were. Eleanor's life was a whirlwind of power, privilege, and wealth, while his own was grounded in struggle and survival. He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they kept creeping back. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself standing alone by the balcony, gazing out over the city lights. The cold air felt like a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. He needed a moment to think, to collect himself. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut, the feeling that this life, this world, wasn't meant for him. Just as he was lost in his thoughts, Eleanor joined him, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She stood beside him for a moment, looking out at the city as well. For the first time since they had entered the gala, she didn't speak, didn't try to control the conversation. There was a quietness between them, a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "You look uncomfortable," she said, her voice soft but direct. Mark didn't know how to respond. He hadn't expected her to notice, let alone comment on it. "I'm just trying to get used to this," he said honestly, his voice betraying the uncertainty he had been carrying with him since that fateful day in her office. Eleanor gave him a long look, as if weighing his words. "I understand," she said finally, her expression unreadable. "This isn't easy for you, but remember, you're here for a reason. You agreed to this." Mark nodded, but her words didn't make him feel any better. He had agreed to this, yes, but now he was starting to wonder if he had made the right choice. Was he truly prepared to live in her world, to play the role of the husband he had never wanted to be? And more importantly, would Eleanor ever see him as more than just a tool in her carefully crafted plan? As the night went on, Mark's discomfort only grew. The voices and laughter of the other guests seemed to blur into the background, and for a moment, he felt like he was drifting in a world that wasn't his own. Eleanor, with her effortless grace and control, was the queen of this world, and he was nothing more than a pawn. And yet, despite the discomfort, a part of him couldn't help but wonder what it would take to change the game. Could he ever truly fit into her world, or would he always be an outsider? By the time the gala came to an end, Mark was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He had spent the entire evening trying to navigate a world he didn't understand, trying to be the man Eleanor needed him to be. But as he followed her out of the ballroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much more complicated than he had ever imagined. And as they stepped into the car, heading back to the life he had agreed to, Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown ahead of him. The following days felt like they were moving in slow motion. Mark had begun to settle into a strange routine. He spent his days attending events with Eleanor, sitting quietly beside her as she handled business deals, made connections, and navigated the world of high society. He felt like a shadow in her life, always present but never really seen. Eleanor never treated him poorly, but there was an emotional distance between them, one that seemed unbridgeable. He was her husband in name only, and nothing more. One morning, after another long night spent at one of Eleanor's lavish charity galas, Mark woke up to a message from her. "We need to talk. Meet me at my office at noon." The simplicity of her words made his stomach churn. It had only been a few weeks since they signed the contract, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had hoped that things might settle down, that he would find some place for himself in her world, but each passing day made him feel more like an outsider. Mark arrived at Eleanor's office exactly at noon, his heart racing as he walked through the sleek, polished lobby. He felt a twinge of discomfort as he entered her office suite. It wasn't the grandness of the space that made him uneasy, it was the realization that it was a world he would never fully understand. Eleanor, dressed in her usual crisp attire, stood by the large windows, looking out at the city below. She turned when she heard him enter, her expression unreadable. "Mark, I've been thinking," she began, her tone measured. "We need to set some boundaries." Mark raised an eyebrow, confused. What did she mean by that? Were the terms of their arrangement not clear enough? Eleanor walked over to the desk and picked up a few papers, flipping through them slowly. "You've been attending events with me for weeks now. You've done your part. But I can't have you getting too comfortable. This marriage, this arrangement, it's about business. Nothing more. I need you to remember that." Mark's heart sank. He had expected to hear something like this, but hearing it out loud made it sting. He had known from the beginning that this was a transaction, a way for both of them to get what they needed. But somewhere along the way, he had started to hope that maybe, just maybe, this could turn into something real. He cleared his throat, trying to mask his frustration. "I understand," he said, though his voice felt tight. "But Eleanor, you've never really told me what you want from this. Why me? Why this arrangement?" Eleanor paused, her eyes narrowing as if she were weighing the truth of his question. "It's simple," she said, her voice low and steady. "I needed a husband for appearances. And you needed a way out. I don't expect love, Mark. I don't need love. What I need is a partnership, a solid arrangement that keeps everything in place." Mark stood there, silently processing her words. This wasn't new information. But hearing it from her, seeing the cold, calculated way she spoke about their marriage, made it feel even more hollow than before. He had been a fool to think that this could turn into anything more. "So that's it, then?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just want a convenient arrangement, and that's all?" Eleanor looked at him with an unreadable expression, her face softening slightly for the first time. It's not that simple. But it doesn't need to be complicated either. I'm offering you a stable life, financial security for you and your family. What more do you need? Mark opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. What did he need? Was financial security enough? Could he truly live with this arrangement? With her? He had hoped that time would somehow change things, that he would start to feel more at home in her world, in their marriage. But now, more than ever, it felt like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't fully understand. I'll do my part, Mark finally said, his voice firm. But I need you to understand something too, Eleanor. This life, this arrangement, it's not what I imagined. I may have agreed to it, but I don't know if I can continue pretending like I don't have feelings. Eleanor's eyes flicked to his, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw a flicker of something like uncertainty, or maybe even understanding. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Feelings are irrelevant, she said, her voice cold once more. You'll adapt. We both will. Now, let's move forward. We have a business to run. Mark's heart sank as he left her office. The weight of the conversation lingered long after he had walked out the door. He had hoped to find something more in this arrangement, some spark, some connection. But all he had found was a cold, distant reality. He was just another pawn in Eleanor's world, and he wasn't sure if he could ever be anything more. As Mark stepped into his car, the city outside seemed to blur together. He didn't know where he was heading or what to expect. All he knew was that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to live. The days after that meeting felt even more disconnected for Mark. He found himself slipping further into the background of Eleanor's life, attending events, signing papers, and smiling when needed, but never truly feeling like part of the world he had married into. Eleanor's icy professionalism hadn't wavered. She was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and that included Mark, but only in the way a business partner might need an associate. Her distance wasn't just emotional, it was calculated, purposeful. There was no room for weakness, no space for the vulnerability Mark felt creeping in as the days wore on. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day spent at a charity event, Eleanor called him to meet at their penthouse apartment. It was the first time she'd asked him to meet her in their shared home outside of scheduled events. Mark wasn't sure what to expect. He hadn't been able to read her lately. They had been living in the same space for weeks now, but still, there was a sense of disconnect, like two people living parallel lives, sharing the same address but not much else. He arrived to find the apartment bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, its windows framing the sprawling view of the city. Eleanor was already sitting by the window, a glass of wine in hand, looking out at the skyline. It was a view Mark could never quite get used to, so different from the small town he had grown up in, a place that now seemed so far away from this world of luxury and polished surfaces. When Eleanor turned to greet him, there was no immediate warmth in her eyes, but something in her expression seemed different. Less businesslike. Mark, she said, her tone lighter than usual, almost casual. Sit down. We need to talk. Mark hesitated but then sat across from her. What's going on? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the gnawing feeling of unease in his chest. Eleanor took a sip of her wine, then set the glass down on the coffee table. I've been thinking about our arrangement, she said slowly, her eyes fixed on him. I know you've been trying to adjust. But I also know it's not easy. I can't keep pretending this is just a business deal. There has to be more to it, even if we're not going to be in love. Mark blinked, unsure of where she was going with this. Was she opening up? Or was this just another manipulation to maintain control? He didn't want to get his hopes up. What are you saying? Eleanor's eyes softened, but only slightly. I'm saying that, maybe, we need to find some middle ground. I'm not expecting romance, Mark. But I do expect something more than this constant tension between us. For the first time in what felt like ages, Mark felt a flicker of hope. He had known from the start that this wasn't going to be a fairy tale, but hearing her acknowledge the strain, seeing her attempt to connect however slightly felt like a small victory. He sat back, taking a deep breath. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "This whole situation, this marriage, it's not what I imagined." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice more quiet, more vulnerable than he had ever heard it before. "I never imagined it either," she said softly. "But here we are. And maybe that's enough. We're in this together, whether we like it or not." Mark was stunned by her words. It wasn't an apology, but it felt like a shift. A shift toward something more human. He wasn't sure if he could trust it yet, but the simple acknowledgement of their shared circumstances made the whole situation feel less one-sided. "So what now?" Mark asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the window, the sunset casting a golden light across her face. "We continue," she said. "We make this work. We have a business to run, after all. But maybe we can stop pretending it's just a business deal." Mark was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He had no idea what this new chapter would bring, but for the first time, he felt like there might be a way forward. A way that wasn't entirely driven by contracts and expectations, but by something more real. Maybe they weren't quite there yet, but they were moving in a direction that didn't feel as cold as before. As the evening settled around them, Mark couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. The road ahead was still uncertain, but something about Eleanor's shift, her willingness to see beyond the surface of their arrangement, made him think that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to navigate this strange new life together. The next few days passed with a quiet intensity. There were still moments of awkwardness, still moments when Mark felt like he was playing a role he didn't quite understand. But there was also a new understanding between him and Eleanor, a silent agreement to stop pretending that everything was just business. As time went on, Mark began to see glimpses of the woman Eleanor could be outside of the businesswoman persona. The small things, her laugh when she got caught in the rain, the way she smiled when she shared a private joke with him, made him wonder if this partnership could evolve into something more than he ever imagined. And as they stood together one evening, watching the city lights twinkle below, Mark realized that for the first time, he wasn't so sure this was just a business arrangement. Maybe Eleanor had been right all along. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than he had thought. The days that followed felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air. Mark found himself spending more time with Eleanor, but it wasn't the same cold, distant interaction he was used to. They still didn't talk about the deeper issues between them, but something unspoken had started to build between them. Eleanor had stopped treating him like just a business partner, and although they didn't admit it, both of them began to share moments that felt more like a real connection. For Mark, it was a small, quiet comfort, but one that made all the difference. It was another late evening when Mark found himself in a conversation with Eleanor that shifted the dynamics even more. They had just come back from another business event, the city lights sparkling outside the penthouse windows, but this time, Mark felt different. Eleanor had changed her routine. She wasn't immediately retreating into work. She sat next to him, her posture less rigid, her expression softened in a way that made Mark wonder what she was thinking. "I know things aren't easy for you," Eleanor began, breaking the silence, her voice softer than usual. "This whole arrangement, it's not something either of us planned, but I can see you trying. And I want to acknowledge that." Mark blinked, surprised by her words. For the first time, Eleanor was showing some level of vulnerability. "I'm just doing what I have to do," he replied quietly, though his heart was beating a little faster. It was strange to hear her acknowledge his efforts. Eleanor glanced at him, her gaze lingering for a moment before she spoke again. "I don't expect this to be perfect. But I also don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want us to keep living like we're just doing our jobs. You deserve more than that, Mark." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Mark had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to respond. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Eleanor turned to face him more fully, her eyes locking onto his. "I mean," she said slowly, "maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is just a contract. Maybe we could try being more than just business partners. I'm not saying we have to fall in love, but we could try to find something more. Something real. Mark was speechless for a moment. Could this really be happening? Was Eleanor, the woman who had kept him at arm's length for so long, actually opening up? He had started to believe that she was unreachable, but now, he wasn't so sure. He swallowed, gathering his thoughts. I'm not sure I know how to do that, he admitted, his voice low. This whole thing has felt so transactional. And I'm not sure what it means for us to go beyond that. Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully, and then she smiled a small, tentative smile that held more warmth than anything she had shown him before. Neither of us knows how to make this work. But I think we owe it to ourselves to try. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a flicker of hope. It was subtle, but it was there. The way Eleanor was looking at him, the way her words hung in the air, it felt like a real shift, like they were both finally stepping into a space that was more than just an agreement, more than just a contract. So, what now? Mark asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty but also curiosity. Eleanor paused, her gaze drifting out the window, watching the city below. Now, we take this one step at a time, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. We'll start by being honest with each other. No more games. No more pretending we're just playing a role. Mark nodded slowly, unsure of what that would look like but feeling like this was the first real chance at something deeper. They weren't at the finish line yet, but they were on the same path now, finally moving forward together. That night, as they both sat in silence, something unspoken passed between them. Mark wasn't sure where this new chapter would take them, but he couldn't deny that he felt more connected to Eleanor in that moment than he ever had before. Maybe this marriage wasn't the dream he'd imagined, but perhaps it was the beginning of something real. They would figure it out, together. And as they both retired to their separate rooms that night, Mark felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't seem so impossible. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor settled into a strange but comfortable routine. They were still not exactly a traditional couple, but there was a noticeable shift in their interactions. No longer was it just about fulfilling the terms of the contract. There were small moments now, genuine smiles, shared jokes, and conversations that went beyond the typical business topics they'd discussed before. Mark started to wonder if maybe Eleanor was beginning to see him as more than just a convenient partner in a transaction. One evening, after another event, Eleanor suggested they take a walk together. It was an unusual request, and Mark couldn't remember the last time she had asked him to do something so simple. They walked through the quiet city streets, the air crisp and cool, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement. For once, they didn't talk about business. There was no agenda, no plan, just two people walking side by side. As they strolled through the park, Eleanor broke the silence, her voice softer than usual. I've been thinking about our arrangement. How we've evolved, she said, looking out at the trees ahead of them. Mark glanced at her, unsure of what to expect. And what have you been thinking? He asked, his voice cautious, yet curious. Eleanor smiled faintly, a hint of something wistful in her eyes. It's strange, you know. When we first agreed to this marriage, I thought it would be nothing more than a transaction. A way to solve problems. But now, she paused, as if searching for the right words. Now I'm not so sure. I don't know what this is anymore, but it feels different. And I don't want to just go back to what it was before. Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. Was she saying what he thought she was saying? He hadn't expected her to admit any of this, certainly not so soon. So, what do you want from this? He asked, his voice quieter now, his breath visible in the cool air. Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him fully. I want to find out what we could be, she said, her eyes meeting his with a sincerity that caught him off guard. I'm not saying we need to fall in love, but I want us to stop pretending that we don't matter to each other. That's all. Mark felt a warmth spread through him as her words sank in. There was no coldness in her voice now, no calculated distance. For the first time since they had entered this arrangement, he felt like he was seeing the real Eleanor, the woman behind the businesswoman, the woman who had been hiding behind walls for so long. And for the first time, he realized that maybe he had been hiding behind walls too. "I think I want that too," Mark admitted, his voice a little more confident now. "I didn't know how to get here, but maybe this is the first real step." Eleanor nodded, her smile returning, softer this time. "It's a step," she agreed. "And I think it's a good one." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation lingering between them, before Eleanor gently reached out and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like everything had changed in that instant. They weren't just two people playing roles anymore. There was something more to this, something real, even if they didn't yet know where it would lead. They continued their walk, hand in hand, the quiet park around them almost like a reflection of the calm that was slowly settling between them. The world felt quieter now, less overwhelming, and for the first time, Mark allowed himself to imagine a future where they could be more than just a business arrangement. Maybe it wouldn't be perfect, but it was a future he could see now, a future with Eleanor, without the walls they had both built around themselves. And as they made their way back to their apartment, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He still didn't know exactly what the future held for them, but for the first time, he felt like it was something worth discovering together. The next day, as they sat down to dinner, their conversation was lighter, more personal. There were no more walls between them, just two people getting to know each other, taking things one step at a time. And that, for now, was enough. Weeks passed, and as much as Mark tried to keep his emotions in check, something within him had shifted. The connection between him and Eleanor had become more than just the business arrangement they had started with. It wasn't instant, but it was real, growing in the small moments they shared, whether it was during quiet dinners at home, walks through the city, or late-night conversations where they talked about everything and nothing at all. Eleanor had been opening up more, her walls slowly coming down, and Mark found himself doing the same. The walls he had built around his own heart, too protective after years of hardship, started to crack, allowing him to feel something he hadn't expected: hope. One evening, Eleanor invited him to a gala that was unlike the others they had attended. It wasn't for business or charity, but a gathering of close friends and acquaintances. As they arrived at the venue, a beautiful mansion on the outskirts of the city, Mark noticed a subtle difference in the air. Eleanor seemed more at ease, more herself. There was no pretension, no pressure to perform, just the two of them entering as equals for once. They mingled with the guests, and as the night wore on, Eleanor slipped away from the crowd and found Mark standing by the window, watching the stars in the sky. She joined him, her presence calm and steady. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the quiet hum of the room. "Maybe we should stop pretending. Not just about our marriage, but about everything. We've come this far, and I think it's time we both acknowledge what's between us." Mark turned to look at her, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. "I mean," she said, taking a breath, "this isn't just a business deal anymore. I know we both started this for reasons that weren't personal, but it's become something more. I don't want to keep pretending that we're just partners in a marriage for convenience." Mark's chest tightened, but he felt a strange sense of relief. He had been waiting for this moment, unsure of how to approach it, and now Eleanor was the one leading the way. "I don't want to pretend either," he said softly, his voice steady. "I don't want to just go through the motions anymore. I know we've both been guarded, but I'm ready to see where this can go. With you." Eleanor's expression softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a genuine smile spread across her face. It wasn't the controlled, polite smile she wore for the publicity, it was a smile that reached her eyes, warm and real. "Then let's stop pretending," she said, her voice low but full of meaning. "Let's take this step by step. We don't have to figure it all out tonight, but we can start by being honest with each other." "Fully honest." Mark nodded, a weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time since they had entered this arrangement, he felt like they were on the same page, moving forward with the same goal: to find something real, not just a partnership for convenience, but something that could grow beyond what either of them had expected. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and easy conversation. The air between them felt different, lighter, as if a door had been opened that neither of them had known was closed. As they left the party and walked back to the car, Eleanor slipped her hand into Mark's, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. The drive home was quiet, but there was no tension between them. The city lights flickered outside, and for the first time, Mark wasn't focused on the distance between them. He wasn't thinking about the walls they had built or the obstacles they still faced. Instead, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had taken a step forward, together. When they got back to the penthouse, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes serious but soft. "This doesn't mean we have all the answers," she said, "but it's a start. And that's enough for me." Mark smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "It's enough for me too," he said quietly. For the first time, the future didn't feel so uncertain. It wasn't perfect, and it would take time to figure everything out, but it was real. And that was something both of them could hold on to as they moved forward together. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor continued to grow closer, their relationship shifting in ways neither of them had anticipated. They were no longer just playing roles, they were learning to trust each other, to share moments of vulnerability, and to slowly build something that felt real. Their lives, once separate and defined by the terms of their marriage contract, began to merge in ways that made them both wonder if they had always been meant to meet each other this way. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their penthouse, Eleanor turned to Mark with a look of contemplation. "Do you ever think about where we started?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Mark smiled, his eyes meeting hers. "I think about it all the time. We were two strangers, just playing roles. But now? I don't know, Eleanor. Now, it feels like something more." Eleanor nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "It's funny, isn't it? How life can lead you to places you never expected, with people you never planned to meet. But sometimes, those unexpected things turn out to be the best part of your life." Mark leaned back against the couch, his hand resting casually on hers. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the kind of peace that comes from knowing they were no longer pretending. This wasn't a business arrangement anymore. It was a partnership, a real one, one that could stand the test of time if they chose to nurture it. A few weeks later, Mark and Eleanor found themselves at a crossroads. The lines between their personal and professional lives had blurred, and it was time for them to make a decision. They had both come so far, and neither of them wanted to go back to the way things had been. They had built something together, and now, they had to decide if they were willing to continue down this road together. It was a quiet morning when Mark brought it up. He and Eleanor were sitting at the breakfast table, the sunlight filtering through the windows, casting a warm glow over everything. He looked at her, his expression serious yet gentle. "Eleanor," he began, "we've come a long way. We've worked through so much. And now, I think it's time we stop pretending this isn't more than just a business arrangement. We've built something real, and I don't want to let that go." Eleanor set down her coffee cup, her eyes meeting his. There was a brief pause, and for the first time, Mark saw her hesitate, really hesitate as if she were considering something that scared her. "I don't want to go back either," she said quietly, her voice firm but soft. "But I need to know, are you sure? Are you sure this is what you want? Because once we take this step, there's no going back. It's not just about us, Anna Marie, it's about everything we've built, everything we've shared." Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his, the warmth of her touch grounding him. "I'm sure," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Eleanor smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Then let's take this step together," she said. "No more walls, no more pretending. Let's see where this goes." That was the moment everything changed. The contract that had once defined their lives was no longer the foundation of their relationship. It was the beginning of something new, something real, and both Mark and Eleanor knew that whatever happened next, they were ready to face it together. Weeks turned into months, and Mark and Eleanor's bond deepened in ways neither of them could have predicted. They continued to grow not just as a couple, but as individuals, each supporting the other in ways they hadn't known were possible. Eleanor, once so guarded, now allowed herself to lean on Mark, and Mark, who had once felt lost, now found himself at peace with the life they had created. And as they stood together on the balcony of their penthouse one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky with colors that mirrored the changes in their lives, Eleanor looked at Mark with a smile. "You were right," she said. "This is something more. Something real." Mark turned to her, his hand on hers, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "I knew it all along." They stood there together, the future uncertain but no longer frightening. They had found something deeper than either of them had expected, something worth fighting for, together. And with that, they took the next step forward, hand in hand, knowing that whatever came their way, they had already built the foundation for a love that was anything but fake.